Hello everybody and welcome to Dry Dock episode 34, and in this episode we are going to announce a few changes to the format of the Dry Dock. This is because, well, frankly, I have to admit defeat. There are so many of you asking so many questions, there's no way I can sustain my original intention of keeping up with questions that are asked in the YouTube comments. I've just been falling further and further behind since I think I probably would need like a 3-4 hour episode to catch up with all the questions that are published each week, which then obviously means that those of you who are asking questions more recently would be looking at months and months before I actually get around to answering them. So that's not really fair on anybody. So I'm going to, as I said, change things up a bit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to extend the dry dock a little bit, so the average dry dock episode should last approximately an hour now. Yeah, we are going to break the hour mark even in this one. And it's going to work with, I'm going to devote the first 20 minutes to answering some sort of selected questions from a video that was published maybe 2 to 3 weeks prior to the particular dry dock episode. That gives everyone a chance to post their questions and comments and such like, and for me to have a look through them all. Then the second 20 minutes, I will still be trying to catch up with previous questions, although I am unfortunately now going to have to take a sort of pick the questions that would provide the best answers. Or at least the most interesting answers, even if those answers are I don't know. And then the third 20 minutes will be obviously answering the Discord questions as we've been doing previously. Now, obviously, those 20 minutes are maybe sort of 18, 19 minutes here, 20, 22 minutes there, but you get the general idea. So, one of the other questions that comes up quite a lot is what are the sources you use for your videos? And as I've answered on previous Dry Dock episodes, it's a mixture of articles available online, printouts that I've got, and reference books as well, with a primary emphasis on checking everything via published work, such as reference books, before I include anything in the video. So partially in answer to that, you can see here this is about 60% of my reference library. It's what I've managed to dig out of the various boxes so far and establish in a new set of shelves. You can see there's a space there for more books as and when I get them out of their boxes, and you can see the kind of reference books I have generally to hand. My vast collection of Jane's Fighting Ships editions is mostly still in other boxes, along with, shall we say, an interesting variety of other reference works. Now, as for specific sources for specific videos, I will try to include or mention them in the Dry Dock segment when we cover those particular videos. And this will also give you a chance to acquire some of those sources yourself. I mean, obviously, you'll be able to go out and buy them by conventional means if you so desire, but I have discovered in the process of moving that I have a great many duplicate books, having collected them over the better part of the past 2 decades. And so, as and when a particular reference book is a duplicate, or there are multiple different books that happen to cover the same subject, some of those will be available in various dry docks for people to win, and then I will send them to you. So that's a slightly cheaper way of expanding your reference collection if you so desire. And so, in that spirit, we will commence this week's Dry Dock looking at the questions raised during the Battle of the Hampton Roads video and the Admiralin class destroyers video. For the Battle of the Hampton Roads, the primary sources used were the excellent article at the Monitor Centre's website, and the books Duel of the Ironclads, War at Sea in the Ironclad Age, and Steam, Steel, and Shellfire. The first of those being the main one, as it dealt exclusively with that particular duel. So, Roland V, or possibly Roland V, asks, where was the second airplane of the Graf Spee stowed? Was it in parts below? Not quite in parts, but practically you might as well say so. It was stored in the deck house underneath the catapult, and in theory, if something happened to the first plane, you could wheel it out and replace it. But in practice, it was basically used as a source of spare parts to keep the first plane flying, because that was actually easier than swapping the two over. And then when they ran out of spares, that was pretty much that. Huey Nguyen asks, how plausible is the Popular Mechanics 1940 Battleship of the Future concept in terms of design and combat viability? Practically just no. It's got quad, triple, and twin turrets. The way it's actually drawn those turrets, I would highly question their ability to actually turn. It's mounting 18 14-inch guns on a displacement similar to Yamato. It's got a ridiculous mixed secondary battery of 5.25-inch and 4.7-inch guns. It's like, well, choose one or the other, for flip's sake. Oh yeah, and it uses its exhaust as part of its torpedo and shell protection. So if it actually gets hit, there's a very good chance that either you can't exhaust your engine gases or else you get tons of water pouring into your engine room. Yeah, great one there, mate. To me, this is a battleship designed by somebody who's seen plenty of streamlined railway locomotives and maybe is aware of what a battleship is, but has no actual detailed idea about how they work. Hayden Lau asks, what countermeasures did warships have against torpedoes other than avoidance and the torpedo defense system? Well, for World War One and World War Two, that was pretty much it. There were cases, like you cite, of the Japanese pilot from Taiho who dove into the sea in the path of the torpedo. There were also cases at the Battle of Samar where aircraft were dropping bombs and machine gunning torpedoes. But generally speaking, although the idea of firing at a torpedo with guns would appear to make sense, the fact of the matter is water is actually very good at stopping incoming shells. So if the torpedo is running shallow, or you're able to drop something like a bomb that maybe won't detonate on impact with the water, or you're able to shoot down into the water at a fairly steep angle, like say from a diving aircraft, then you might be able to take out a torpedo or two, but that's never something that you can particularly rely on. There is a story from the Merchant Marine of somebody managing to accidentally dash slightly on purpose take out an incoming U-boat torpedo with their rifle, but that was kind of a 1 in a million shot, and largely down to the fact that torpedo was probably shallow running anyway. So yeah, there's all sorts of ad hoc measures you could take, but generally speaking, the only reliable ones were either get out of the way or hope that your designers had done their job when it came to your torpedo defense system. The Black Jackal asks, what roles could the Malta class have played in the post-war Royal Navy? Would they have seen careers like the Essexes, or would they have been the victims of post-war cuts? So the Malta class would have offered the Royal Navy far, far greater aircraft carrier capability than what they historically ended up with after the Second World War, with a couple of Audaciouses, the Victorious, and later on the Hermes, basically forming the bulk of the Cold War carrier fleet. If all four of them had been built, then I think perhaps the Royal Navy would have downsized most of their wartime carriers pretty sharpishly, as well. Greater operational capability is always a good thing per ship, but also if they downsized away those things like the Illustriouses, the Indefatigables, etc., it means they've got a fleet of four carriers which are of a common type, common maintenance, common capabilities, much easier to maintain than what they ended up historically with, which was a fleet that contained 4 or 5 different classes of carriers, each with their own operational and maintenance needs. It's even possible that in those circumstances, with a slightly reduced overall operating and maintenance cost, especially if maybe one or two were decommissioned over time, the Royal Navy might have managed to retain its fixed-wing aircraft capability through the early 1970s cuts, which could potentially result in a couple of modernised Maltas rocking up at the Falklands in 1982, which would have been a rather unpleasant surprise for the Argentinian Air Force, shall we say. Bredley asks, could the US have won the naval war in World War II by itself? I'm going to guess by this you're effectively assuming that maybe Britain's knocked out of the war or signs a peace treaty or something to that effect, where the navy can't be used against Germany and Japan. The answer is yes. Yes, they could. It would take a lot longer because they'd have to split their resources a lot more than they historically did. But ultimately, they have the ultimate fallback of the fact that neither the Imperial Japanese Navy nor the Kriegsmarine can actually operate any kind of meaningful naval force off the US coast, with the exception of a few submarines. And so even if it takes the US another 2 or 3 years to build up the truly stupid amounts of aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, etc., that it would need to fight the entirety of the Axis powers solo, they could do that. Certainly. That's not to necessarily say the early part of the war would go very well for them if they were on their own, but if you can't reach your enemy's homeland and they're bigger than you, they will eventually come back and squash you like a bug. And finally, Enclave216 asks, how was mathematics used during the Second World War in naval gunnery? What calculations would be needed to be made in order to fire the main guns? And how has that changed in the modern world? So, since we haven't upgraded to Earth 2.0, the laws of physics are still the same as they were during the Second World War, so the calculations are also the same. The main difference is speed and precision of those calculations, which can obviously be done a lot faster these days by modern computers, assuming that they get the right input. So, very briefly and quickly, the calculations that need to be made account for a number of variables. So, you've got to have your speed, the enemy's speed, and your course and the enemy's course, and then that gives you an idea of whether you're closing on the enemy, overtaking the enemy, dropping behind, or pulling away. That then gives a projected position of where the two ships are going to be relative to each other after the shell flight time, which is calculated based on the distance between the ships. You then obviously have to work out that shell flight time dependent on range, lead the target by that amount, take into account the whether, as I said, if you're closing or pulling away, because that's going to change things slightly. You also have to account somewhat for atmospheric conditions, the ship's roll, the ship's pitch, and other sea state affecting items such as spray and such like. And then you've also got to account for how, if you want to get right down into fine detail, how old your gun barrel is, how many times you've fired it that day, has it warmed up or not, and what charges are you using in your guns, and all of that and more, all goes into working out exactly where the shell will go if you fire it, and then changing though the factors like gun elevation and turret position until the place that you think the shell's going to go is equal to the place where you think the enemy ship is going to be in the sort of 20 or 30 seconds time when the shell lands. And now on to the questions on the Admiralen class video. And the primary sources for this particular video were the Royal Dutch Navy's own website covering the class, and also Conway's All the World's Fighting Ships 1922 to 46, which you would have seen earlier in the video. No Name asks, with regards to next on the list, is this the order they will come out to, or is it randomized? Generally speaking, unless something goes horribly wrong, the next on the list, which is published on the 5-minute guides, is the exact order that videos will be published. That's basically purely chronological record of when ships were requested, and so I will just keep posting videos following that list. So if you want to know when a ship is due out this year for its 5-minute guide, take a look at that next on the list, and you should be able to work it out. It's not obviously the entire list. I keep the entire list on my PC, but as you can see, that list is long enough, and adding more to it to have the full list there all the time would probably ruin the YouTube description section. Barry Hope Sergeant Hope asks, in the old movie In Which We Serve by Noel Coward, what class was the destroyer? So the film was based around the exploits of HMS Kelly, which was a K-class destroyer, but in the film the fictional HMS Torrin is portrayed by HMAS Nepal, which was an N-class destroyer. But on the plus side, the K and N class were both subclasses of the overall JK and N classes, so appearance-wise the ship wasn't that much drastically different to the one which inspired the film in the first place. None of Your Business asks, would you consider a video on naval hospital ships? Yeah, I certainly would. I think there's 1 or 2 hospital ships on the overall list as well. They are a bit further down though. And now moving on to the rest of the questions. Long Lake Shore asks, how difficult was it to modify the armour protection on partly completed Lexington and Amagi-class battle cruisers when they were converted to aircraft carriers? Well, in those cases, since their main belts were external to the ship, they weren't the kind of sloped internal belts of the kind you see in some later designs. It was relatively easy if the ship wasn't hadn't had its armour fitted already. It was just a case of, well, don't. And if it had been, you would just take it off and put on either some kind of just hull strengthening plate or slightly thinner armour plate. Bear in mind, obviously, armour was expected to take hits, was expected to take damage, and therefore, although obviously not easy to remove, it was designed with the idea that you might have to replace sections of it in mind. Following up on last week's video, where I missed out answering what I thought of Admiral Halsey's actions at Leyte Gulf, and I also forgot to mention the Royal Australian Navy and Royal Canadian Navy in terms of what those navies did best. So with Admiral Halsey, I think he left with regards to Leyte Gulf, where he went charging off after the Japanese decoy force. He had his reasons, obviously. The Japanese carriers, in theory, could have been a threat, albeit that Japanese naval air power was pretty lacking at this point in the war. And it's definitely not some force of enemy carriers and escorts is not something that you could ignore in any way, shape, or form. So yes, he should have gone and engaged them, but at the same time, taking his entire force was a massive, massive degree of overkill, and the haste at which he just tore off after them without leaving any real clear instructions as to what the heck he was doing. That was more him just, I think personally, I think he just wanted the glory that some of the other US admirals had managed to acquire in the bigger battles of the Second World War up till that point. So I think he let his own personal pride and ambition get in the way of sensible tactical thinking. He really should have left some forces behind to continue to guard the strait, or either that, or at least made it clear to everybody that he was leaving it open, one way or the other. Yeah, he didn't need to take everything with him, not by a long shot. And as I say, even though you can't afford to ignore an enemy force like that, that the US was fairly confident about the general state of the Japanese Navy at the time. It wasn't like they were going to be expecting the Japanese to be of the caliber they were at, say, Midway or Coral Sea, not by a long shot. In terms of what the various navies are good at, the Royal Australian Navy, well, to a greater or lesser degree, depending on how we want to look at it, they actually managed to out-Royal Navy the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy, obviously, during the Second World War, had a fairly distinct reputation for not backing down from a fight wherever it was needed to, even if the situation seemed otherwise helpless. So they were generally fairly aggressive in their movements, obviously with the exception of the rather more strategic thinking around the Indian Ocean operations in the middle of the war. But generally, when you look at the Mediterranean theatre especially, which is where most of the Royal Australian Navy operated, until the latter part when obviously Pacific operations started to gear up a lot more. You've got ships like the HMAS Sydney and such, and the so-called Scrap Iron Flotilla, and their performance was so good that the British admiral in charge of the Mediterranean fleet specifically went out to requisition as many Royal Australian Navy ships as he could. Obviously, again, that's not to say the Royal Navy was bad at its job, but the Royal Australian Navy were particularly good. They sort of took it a step further in terms of their general warlike conduct and aggressiveness in action. So, yeah, Royal Australian Navy, very, very elite professional fighting force. And when it comes to the Royal Canadian Navy, well, obviously they're not particularly known for fleets of battleships and cruisers and such, even though the Royal Canadian Navy did become one of the largest navies in the world by the end of World War II, going by numbers of ships in only, most of these being escorts and destroyers. So it may come as no surprise to you that the Royal Canadian Navy became rather expert at anti-submarine warfare and convoy escort duties. Again, obviously they were sharing that duty with the US Navy and the Royal Navy primarily, but when both of those navies have to sort of divide their attention between that kind of stuff plus battleship actions, aircraft carriers, cruiser fleets, etc., the Royal Canadian Navy was able to focus purely on the convoy escort and anti-submarine warfare aspect of things to a large extent, obviously not entirely. They did have other ships, but yeah, so their specialization and sort of what they did best would come into that field of operations. Jack Barucha says, do you think Britain could have sustained a stronger navy after the loss of the Empire? Why did the UK choose to neglect the fleet to the point where it's but a shadow of its former glory? And do you believe that France or the UK has the stronger navy at the moment? So, could it have sustained a stronger navy after the loss of the Empire? Yeah, probably. Um, Britain was a bit broke by the end of the Second World War, but if you're talking about by the time the Empire was mostly gone, um, that situation had passed. On the other hand, it's the British government, and obviously I say, although I try and avoid politics, I have said in other time at other points in various videos, Britain got an empire in spite of the British government, and Britain has mostly won most of its wars, again in spite of the British government. And the Royal Navy in peacetime has always been, apart from the sort of the 19th century and early 20th century, otherwise has always been something of a victim of government cuts. So if the government had chosen to reprioritise its spending a little bit from various other political short-sighted programs that you always get, and especially in the UK, then yes, it could have sustained a stronger navy. As for why it chose to neglect the fleet, pretty much the same answer. It's politics. It's much easier to say, oh, we're spending money on X thing that can't possibly be seen as bad, as opposed to the warlike navy. But yeah, the less said about politicians and their stupid promises, the better. As for whether France or the UK has the stronger navy these days, I think you're probably going to find that overall the UK has the stronger navy. Now, I know the UK, the Royal Navy, has technically at the moment slightly fewer ships than the French Navy, but there are a couple of factors that need to be considered when you're talking about this kind of thing. One of which is that the Royal Navy, although small, has still maintained quite an extensive logistical support fleet, and therefore you can pretty much, if you needed to, deploy the entire Royal Navy anywhere you want in the world. This is a capability that precisely one other navy in the world has, and that's the US Navy. The French could not deploy the bulk of their fleet across the planet. Their logistics support fleet is much smaller. They would only be able to deploy a smaller element of their fleet, and so in terms of power projection, the Royal Navy is significantly stronger than the French. You also have the fact that, at least at the minute, the French numerical superiority is largely dictated by the fact they have a number of very lightweight combatant ships, sort of very light frigates verging onto corvettes, whereas the Royal Navy doesn't really have anything in the light frigate-corvette category at the moment, although the offshore patrol vessels Type 31s might change that. The Royal Navy generally at the moment is made up of fairly large destroyers and large frigates, so on an individual ship-to-ship combatant basis, at least in the surface warship categories, the Royal Navy possesses the more capable ships in general. You've also then got to look at the submarine forces, and the Astutes and with the outgoing Trafalgars are significantly more capable than the French nuclear attack submarines that are either in service at the moment or coming into service. They're much bigger. They've got arguably a lot significantly superior weapons. And again, similar to the sort of which World War II Navy does things best, that doesn't mean the French underwater forces are bad. It just means that the Royal Navy has a qualitatively superior force, which is the part of the question. In terms of aircraft carriers, obviously, that one's a little bit of a toss-up in as much as the Royal Navy at the moment technically doesn't have an operational carrier, but once the Queen Elizabeth and Prince of Wales are in service, they will significantly outclass the Charles de Gaulle, which obviously is not in service all the time because there's only one of it, and has continuous problems with the fact they made a nuclear-powered carrier with a reactor that really has a power output that's far, far too small for it. I don't know quite why they went with that particular decision, but oh well, there you go. Seasprint asks, thanks for the informative videos. When a warship goes into dry dock for refit or repair for, say, new engines, how are those installed? Is the entire aft deck and superstructure removed, or are items like engines installed piecemeal? Well, if a ship is going in for something as major as an engine replacement, then yeah, effectively, well, you see the pictures that are going up as part of this answer. Effectively, this ship is almost stripped down to its main deck level in a lot of aspects. Obviously, on battleships, they tend to leave the gun turrets in place, but sometimes not even those. To a certain degree, when you're talking about the refits of the scale where the engines are replaced, it's almost a complete rebuild of the ship, outside of the main structural elements. So yeah, that and obviously the engines being fairly large, they do have to take apart fairly large parts of the ship to get at them and get them out and put the new ones in. And at this point, I'm going to have to say that, despite what I said at the beginning in the admin section, this dry dock is probably actually going to be a relatively shorter one for two reasons. One was the fact I only got the internet on Friday, so I'm having to record this dry dock at the very last minute. And two, I think I have some kind of throat infection and my voice is going, so I'm going to have to move on to the Discord questions at this point because I don't think my voice is going to last too much longer. Sorry about that. Hopefully we'll get the new format up and running for next week's dry dock. The Great King asks, with relation to the illegal salvage of Prince of Wales and Repulse, with this being an obvious desecration of a war grave, and obviously this has happened to a number of other ships, including Dutch ships as well, what kind of approaches do you think we should take to protect these ships, along with other warships lying on the seabed within reach of Vandals? To be honest, unfortunately, there's not a tremendous amount that we can realistically do. The thing is, if you put any kind of guard over it, well, the host, the nation in question whose ship sunk, has to be willing to put a ship at the disposal of guard duty, which is probably unlikely to happen. There's also the problem that a number of ships that have sunk in shallow waters, because of course the biggest defence against salvage is that it's far too deep, but for the ships that have sunk in shallower waters, obviously borders have changed. Those ships might now lie in the territorial waters of other nations, and though that limits the nation whose ship it is ability to actually do anything, and all other measures that immediately come to mind involve both knowing and to some extent revealing where the ships are, which just makes them a little bit more of an easy target. Unfortunately, the two best things you could probably do would be one, either to come to some kind of agreement with whichever nation is nearest to try and enforce some kind of protection, but that can be more or less difficult depending on exactly which nation you're talking about. The other thing that you could try is to maybe have some kind of general international law, international precedent set, probably in the UN, that made the salvage excavation disturbance of designated war graves into a crime across the board. Then again, that's probably not going to stop a lot of third world countries. And again, it runs into the fact if you're going to list the war grave, you probably will end up having to list where it is, which goes back to the whole, well, you're telling everyone where to go at that point. It is a very difficult one. Much as I'd love to place some kind of automated defense system down next to the wreck to just sink anybody who comes near it with the intent of salvaging, unfortunately we don't have smart AI weapons that are capable of working out intent, and a lot of these ships obviously were fighting for or in very heavily trafficked waters, so you can't just randomly be blowing up every passing merchant ship. So it's a very difficult question, and if anybody's got any better ideas, I'd love to hear them. Clay Pigeon asks, why wasn't sonar put on every single warship in World War II? If you have enough sonar units to put on every single destroyer escort, then you have enough to put on every single cruiser, carrier, and battleship as well. The answer is partly role. If you start putting sonar on every ship that you own, there's a great temptation to actually use it, and as the first part of the Second World War pointed out, using a carrier itself as a ship to hunt a submarine, not such a wise move. There's also the issue of weight. If you put a sonar unit in, well, you're adding more crew, you're adding more equipment, you're adding more weight, and it's also means some fairly extensive work to the underside of the ship. And in a war where ships' displacement is going up all the time because they're adding new radar, new communication systems, new anti-aircraft guns, etc., etc., if it's a system that you're barely going to use and adds quite a few tons to your overall displacement when you really need that weight for things like Bofors guns and radar arrays, then it's probably a better idea to spend the spare displacement that your ship has on those things rather than a sonar system where, to be honest, if you're using it, something's already gone horribly wrong. Clay Pigeon also asks, what if Admiral King embraced British help and worked more closely with the Royal Navy in the Pacific? Well, Admiral King's hands were constrained somewhat by orders from high up, so he wasn't able to do what he really wanted to do, which was kick the British out of the Pacific entirely. But in overall terms, it might have saved quite a few lives, as if he had overcome his intense dislike of the British to the point of adopting them fully into his fleet command structure, that could have meant both the British being around in force earlier, somewhat slightly earlier, and also operating a lot more closely together, which obviously means more fighter defences, more anti-aircraft firepower, more warning, and to be honest, given you were talking about kamikaze attacks, more targets. And so that might have not necessarily prevented, but avoided some of the worst casualties encountered by kamikaze aircraft due into the fact that not as many of them would have gotten through, and the ones that did might well have chosen to go after a British armoured carrier or something, which would therefore be a much better placed to take the hit rather than getting something like Bunker Hill. Cooper Trooper 3 asks, if the Anglo-German naval arms race kept going, could the Germans ever outproduce the British in terms of ships? Unfortunately for the Germans, no, not really. Britain had so much of a head start, and obviously when the German navy kicked off its expansion, the Imperial Navy that is, the British just started pouring more and more effort into building more and more ships. And bear in mind, the British were able to completely outbuild the Germans in the run-up to World War One, whilst simultaneously building multiple capital ships and other vessels for foreign powers, some of which, of course, they acquired, shall we say, at the start of the war. So the British were never really at risk of being outbuilt by the Germans, and as a result, in the real life history, the Germans had actually pretty much given up on the whole naval arms race bit by the early 1910s, when they'd realised this is never going to work. Albeit obviously Tirpitz's original strategy called for a fleet that was just big enough to challenge the Royal Navy and force it into a state where it couldn't actively take offensive action against Germany rather than trying to match it ship for ship. But somewhere along the lines, probably somewhere between the Kaiser's left ear and right ear, something got a little bit lost in translation. Fort Master says, if the various naval treaties hadn't been put into place, how much later do you think carriers would have been developed, and how long do you think it would have been before some countries started considering 20-inch guns? Well, carriers were already in development before the Washington Naval Treaty. You had various seaplane carriers operational during the First World War, and of course the experiments with HMS Furious and such like immediately at the end of and after the First World War. So carriers were around, and they would have been developed anyway, possibly developed slower, because you look at the first purpose-built carriers, things like Ho Shou and Hermes, they're considerably smaller than the colossal conversions of the Lexington, Saratoga, Amagi, or Kagi, and Kaga. So, in a lot of ways, the Washington Naval Treaty did give carriers a big kick in development, as they showed that actually carriers could be significantly larger, and this increased size could have great utility. So yeah, that's probably how it would have affected carriers. How long do you think it would have been before someone considered 20-inch guns? Well, the Japanese were already looking at that at the tail end of their design speculation in the early 1920s. Whether or not a 20-inch gun is ever really practical in naval warfare and how it would have been deployed is always obviously up for the question. As I've said before, I think 18 inch is probably about the upper limit for practical use. You could probably get a 20-inch to work, but I wouldn't think it offered that many advantages unless someone went with one of the earlier Tillman designs with 19 inches of armor. But yeah, if someone had decided to go with 20-inch guns, you probably would have seen them roll out in the late 20s, early 30s. Berg the Boat Boy asks, what are the reasons for placing ring-like instead of box-belt magazines on 37mm cannons, such as the one found in this image of a mid-war US torpedo boat? Mostly simplicity and ease of operation. You don't have quite the same restrictions on a ship-mounted weapon like that as you do on sort of ground-based weapons in terms of sort of portability and bulk. So, I mean, obviously that kind of thing on a tank or something would be incredibly bulky and impractical. But also, the sort of ring-mounted magazine is a lot easier to feed shells into. Basically, almost all of the reload can be handled just by the gun's movement. Whereas if you're using a box magazine, you are going to be looking at springs, internal springs and such, having to contribute quite significantly to loading the shells properly. And if you're on a heaving ship in the middle of a saltwater environment, you can't necessarily rely on those lasting for any particular length of time, especially on the bow of a torpedo boat. And in terms of belt, a belt would just get everywhere and would, especially considering what belts were made of at the time, probably just tend to disintegrate. Ask the Prince of Wales' pom-pom gunners how that worked out for them. So yeah, this is basically the simplest and most reliable way of having lots and lots of shells available to you in an environment such as the one depicted there when you're on the bow of a torpedo boat a few feet above the water. And as I said, unfortunately, despite the comments in the first part, my voice is pretty much shot. I'm still getting used to the acoustics of the new place, and I need to get this video up and out. So I'm going to call it quits there, and hopefully the new format will be available first thing on the next Dried Up video. Thank you very much for watching. Obviously, please leave comments below and let me know what you think.